I found out the truth the night I came home early from a work trip, when I heard my mother-in-law's voice coming through my fiancé's phone on speaker. And she said, clear as anything, no hesitation, "She's sweet, but she's not the right fit for our family." You know who is. She was talking about my best friend. And he didn't argue, he just said, "I know, I've been thinking the same thing." I stood in the hallway of the apartment we had picked out together, the one with the bay window I loved, and the creaky third step on the stairs that we always laughed about, and I couldn't move. My coat was still on. My bag was still on my shoulder. The keys were in my hand. I just stood there and listened to the man I was supposed to marry in 4 months discuss replacing me with the woman who had been my closest friend since university. Her name was Ingrid, my fiancé's name was Brett, and his mother, Eleanor, had apparently decided, somewhere along the way, that I wasn't good enough for her son, and that Ingrid, with her family's old real estate money and her seat on the board of a provincial arts foundation, was a far better investment. I should explain who I am, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand where I came from and how far I had pulled myself. I grew up in Sudbury. My dad worked the mines for 30 years. My mom cleaned vacation properties up near the Lake District in the summers and took whatever retail shifts she could get in the winter. We weren't poor in the way that people sometimes romanticize. We were just always calculating, always looking at the hydro bill twice, always deciding between the dentist and the car insurance. I got a partial scholarship to study environmental law at the University of Ottawa, took out the rest in student loans, and spent 4 years surviving on pasta and library hours. By the time I was 32, I had paid off most of my debt, built a career I was genuinely proud of, and was engaged to a man I believed loved me for exactly who I was. Brett came from Toronto money. Not flashy, ostentatious money, the quiet, entrenched kind. The kind where the family cottage has been in the same hands for 3 generations and you don't discuss what things cost because everything has always simply been available. He was a civil engineer, smart, measured, good with people. His mother, Eleanor, was widowed and ran the family's investment portfolio with the kind of focused intensity that I had always respected, even when I felt her watching me too carefully at family dinners. Ingrid had known Brett almost as long as she had known me. We all moved in overlapping circles in Ottawa, the kind of city where the professional and social worlds collapse into each other at dinner parties and gallery openings. She was charming, cultured, and her family's name appeared on the donor wall of 3 different institutions downtown. Eleanor adored her. I had always assumed that was simply because they had more in common. I never thought it was something more strategic than that. I was wrong. Standing in that hallway, I learned that Eleanor had been having conversations with Brett for months. Gentle at first, she had apparently said. Just observations, how Ingrid seemed so comfortable in certain rooms, how aligned her values were with the family's longer-term interests, how my background, lovely as it was, might create friction over time, different expectations around money, around lifestyle, around what they were building. And Brett had listened, and then he had agreed. What I did next is not what I would have done if I had been calmer, or more strategic, or if I had given myself even one night to sleep on it. I walked into the living room, I set my bag on the floor, and I looked at him and I said, "How long has your mother been convincing you that I'm not enough?" The look on his face told me everything I needed to know about how long that conversation had been going on. He tried to talk. He used words like practical and long-term compatibility and family alignment. He said he cared about me deeply. He said this wasn't about my worth as a person. He said he hoped I could understand that some decisions were bigger than just 2 people. I asked him if Ingrid knew. He hesitated, which meant yes. I asked how long. He looked at the floor. I took off the ring. I set it on the coffee table between us, and I left. I drove to my sister's place in Kanata. I sat in her kitchen at midnight while she made tea neither of us really wanted, and I told her everything. She didn't say much. She just kept refilling my mug and occasionally saying "okay" in a way that meant she was holding herself together for my sake. Later, she would tell me she had never trusted Eleanor from the beginning, but that night she just sat with me. Sometimes that's the only thing that helps. The next few weeks were the kind that you survive rather than live. I called Ingrid. I needed to hear it from her directly. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her I knew, there was a pause. Not the pause of shock, but the pause of someone choosing their next words very carefully. She said she was sorry. She said it had never been her intention to hurt me. She said that Eleanor had approached her, that it had felt complicated, that she hadn't known how to tell me. I said, "You knew for months, and you kept coming to brunch with me. You sat in my apartment and looked at wedding magazines with me. You knew." She said, "I know. I'm sorry." I hung up. I want to be honest about what the next period of my life looked like, because I think people sometimes skip over it in stories like this. They jump to the rebuild, the blow-up, the triumphant return. But there was a stretch of about 3 months where I was genuinely not okay. I went to work. I did my job. I was functional in all the visible ways. But I was also lying awake at 3 in the morning doing the calculation that I think every woman does when something like this happens, wondering if Eleanor had been right, if there was something about where I came from, something about how I moved through certain rooms that had always made me a poor fit for the life I thought I was building. I did not sleep well. I ate badly. I cried in my car more than once in the parking garage at work. What helped, and this sounds simple but it wasn't, was deciding to stop waiting for my life to resume and start building something else entirely. I had a colleague named Rowan who had been suggesting for over a year that I consult independently rather than staying at the firm. I called him on a Thursday evening and told him I was ready to talk seriously about it. Within 6 months, I had my first 3 clients. Within a year, I had left the firm entirely and was working for myself, primarily on environmental assessment projects for municipalities and First Nations communities across northern Ontario. The work was harder and more meaningful than anything I had done before. I was earning more than I ever had, and I was doing it entirely on my own terms. I also moved, not out of Ottawa right away, but I found a new apartment in the Glebe that I furnished slowly and deliberately, choosing every single thing myself with no committee, no compromise, no quietly deferred opinion. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was through the consulting work that I met my husband. His name is Laurent. He's Quebecois, raised in Chicoutimi, the son of a foreman and a school librarian. He has a PhD in hydrology and runs an environmental research centre at Cartleton. He's the kind of person who argues passionately about water policy at dinner and then does the dishes without being asked, and means both things with equal conviction. I met him at a multi-stakeholder consultation in Timmins, where we were both there in a professional capacity, and we disagreed fairly intensely about a specific regulatory framework in front of a room of 15 people. And afterward he bought me a coffee and said he thought I had made 3 very good points and 1 very wrong one. And he would love to debate all 4 of them properly if I had the time. I had the time. We took things slowly. I was careful in a way I hadn't been before, not guarded exactly, but deliberate. He noticed, and he didn't push. He just kept showing up, consistently in small ways that added up to something I could eventually trust. We dated for 2 years before we moved in together. We got engaged quietly, on a canoe trip near Tamagami, with no audience and no performance. We got married the following spring in a small ceremony in the Laurentians, with 30 people who actually mattered to us. I did not invite my former fiancé or my former best friend. I did not invite Eleanor. I didn't think about any of them much at all by then. That was not forgiveness exactly. It was more like disinterest. They had stopped taking up space in my mind, and I hadn't noticed exactly when that had happened. Then came my father's retirement party. My dad had worked 31 years for the same mining company before his knees finally made the decision for him. My aunt organised a party at a hall in Sudbury, the kind of event my family does well, which is to say loud and warm and a little chaotic, with too much food and a playlist that jumps from country to classic rock to something my cousin put on that nobody over 40 could identify. Laurent and I drove up from Ottawa. My sister flew in from Calgary with her kids. It was genuinely one of the better evenings of my recent life. What I had not thought about, and should have, was that Sudbury is not a large city, and that Brett's firm had been contracted on a provincial infrastructure project in the region for the past year, which I knew in the abstract, but had not connected to anything that would touch my actual life. He was at a restaurant 2 doors down from the hall where we were celebrating. I know this because I stepped outside after dinner to call my sister's babysitter about a question regarding the kids, and I nearly walked directly into him on the sidewalk. We both stopped. He looked different, tired in a way that wasn't just the hour. There was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before. A flatness, a kind of careful blankness that I recognized as the expression people wear when they are working hard, not to show something. Ingrid was with him. She had changed her hair. She was looking at her phone and didn't see me immediately. When she looked up, she went completely still. Neither of them said anything for a moment. And then Brett said, "Hey." Just that. Like we were acquaintances who had run into each other at the grocery store. I said hello. I was genuinely calm. This surprised me, but it was true. Laurent had followed me out a few seconds later because he'd seen me get up and wanted to know if everything was all right. He came and stood beside me in the easy, natural way he has, not protective, not performative, just present. He introduced himself when I introduced him, shook Brett's hand without any particular awareness of or interest in the history, asked Ingrid a polite question about how she knew me. I watched Brett's face during all of this. I watched him take in Laurent, his ease, his confidence, the way he stood in his own life without any apparent effort, and I watched something move across Brett's expression that I won't describe as regret exactly, but it was something in that neighbourhood. Ingrid barely spoke. She said it was nice to meet Laurent. She said I looked well. She did not look well herself. There was a tension between her and Brett that was visible even in a 2-minute sidewalk conversation. The slightly too careful way they stood near each other, the absence of any small physical ease. I had heard through my sister, who had stayed loosely connected to some of the old social circle, that the marriage had been struggling, that Eleanor's vision of what they would build together had not quite materialized the way she had planned, that Ingrid found certain expectations suffocating, that Brett found Ingrid difficult in ways he hadn't anticipated, that none of it had turned out to be as simple as his mother had assured him it would be. We said goodbye after maybe 3 minutes. Laurent and I walked back into the hall. He asked me who they were. I gave him the short version. He listened, nodded once, and then said, "Your dad's about to do his speech, we should get back in." That was it. That was the entire weight the encounter held. Later that night, after my dad had made everyone laugh and then cry in the space of 5 minutes, after my sister's kids had fallen asleep on a stack of coats in the corner, after the hall had emptied out and Laurent and I were driving back to the hotel through the dark streets of the city I grew up in, I thought about Eleanor. I thought about her assessment of me, the calculation she had made, the conclusion she had reached about my value, my suitability, my fit. I thought about what I had built since then, the career that was entirely mine, the partner who had chosen me with full information and kept choosing me, quietly and consistently, every single day, the life that fit me exactly because I had made every piece of it myself, without deference to anyone else's vision of what I should be. Eleanor had looked at me and seen a liability, a woman from the wrong postal code with the wrong last name and the wrong kind of family money. She had made a business decision and moved a person around like a piece on a board, and I thought she was right that I wasn't built for that life. She just had the analysis backwards. I wasn't a poor fit for their world. Their world was a poor fit for me. Laurent reached over in the dark and found my hand without looking, the way you do when someone is so familiar that you don't need to check. I squeezed back, and I let it go, all of it, finally and completely, somewhere on the highway between Sudbury and wherever we were going next. I keep coming back to that sidewalk in Sudbury, the way Brett said hey, like we were strangers who had once shared a coffee, not two people who had picked out furniture together and talked about what we'd name our kids someday. And the way Ingrid went, still. Not guilty exactly, but careful. The way people go still when they've been caught living with a choice that didn't turn out the way they planned. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I think there's something honest in that moment worth sitting with. Eleanor made a calculation. She looked at me, my accent, my postal code, my parents' jobs, my student debt. And she decided I was a liability. She moved people around to protect an outcome she had decided on without once considering that the people she was moving had their own lives, their own weight, their own right to make choices with full information. That's not strategy. That's a failure of basic decency. And the thing about that kind of failure is that it doesn't stay contained. It spreads into everything it touches. A marriage built on a transaction, on someone else's ambition, on the absence of honesty, that's not a foundation, that's a waiting collapse. What I learned, slowly and not all at once, is that integrity isn't a quality that protects you from hard things. It's the quality that determines what you build after them. I couldn't control what Eleanor decided about me. I couldn't control what Brett chose. But I could control whether I became someone I recognized, whether I kept going to work and doing it well. Whether I told the truth in my own life even when it cost me something. Whether I showed up for my sister at midnight when she needed me, the way she had shown up for me. And I learned, really learned, in the way you only learn through living it, that clarity is more valuable than cleverness. Eleanor was clever. She had a plan. She executed it. She thought she had accounted for every variable. But she wasn't clear-eyed about what actually makes a life hold together. She optimized for the wrong things and got the wrong result. I had to get very quiet after everything fell apart and ask myself what I actually wanted, not what I thought I should want, not what looked right from the outside, but what I genuinely cared about. That kind of honest thinking is harder than it sounds. It took me months, but it was the most useful work I did in that whole period. And then there was the part that nobody talks about enough. Just continuing, getting up, going to work, making the call to Rowan, finding the new apartment, furnishing it slowly. Not waiting for the feeling of being ready, because that feeling doesn't come first, it comes after. You don't feel capable and then act. You act, and somewhere in the middle of acting, you find out you were capable all along. Laurent reached over in the dark on the drive home from Sudbury and found my hand without looking. That small thing, that easy, unthinking gesture, was the whole answer to every question Eleanor had ever asked about my worth. Not the degrees, not the career, not the income, just someone who reached for me in the dark because I was the person he wanted beside him. That's what good choices accumulate into, not trophies. Just a life that actually fits.